And now we are going to run a session about engineering ethics in Web3. And the reason why we are running this session is, number one, it's a hot topic. Number two, it's part of the module 1 of TE Fundamentals, the article Engineering Ethics in Web3 by Michael Zargham is part of this module 1. And when I asked him, he just joined us, welcome. When I asked him, could you produce a video introduction, why you've written this article, what was the starting point, and some reflections on that, he told me, why don't we record this with the students of TE Academy? And here we go. This session is going to be recorded, it's going to be added to the module 1. And we'd like actually to provide you an overview on this article, and in the second part of this conversation, take your questions and have a discussion on engineering ethics in Web3. And I dropped some links in the chat. If you take a look in the Zoom call, there are links, number 1, to the article that we are going to discuss. You might have seen it already or read it. It's actually a brief article, but with a lot of food for thought. And second, add your question and vote on questions here. There's a Slido link. And over the last couple of days, we already started collecting questions and statements, and feel free to add yours in the course of the conversation and vote on the questions, so that we can crowdsource basically the topics we'd like to discuss with Z. And now I'd like to first welcome Michael Zargham in this call. Thanks for joining us today. We'll have people joining online and also at full note here in this space. People joined us for this session, and thanks for coming. Z, maybe we start with a brief introduction for those who don't know you yet.
Sure. So I'm Michael Zargham. I am the founder and chief engineer at Block Science. And sort of for the purpose of today, I think it's mostly that I've been trained in engineering, not so much software engineering, robotics and multi-agent systems and lots of relevant stuff to designing algorithms. But having been trained in a more engineering specific tradition, I've had at least a few opportunities to reflect on the differences, at least sort of socially and culturally, between the sort of profession of developing software and the sort of profession of designing and testing and maintaining sort of public infrastructure. And honestly, for the purpose of today, I think that suffices. The plan for this session wasn't so much to give a lecture, because I remember how boring my engineering ethics lectures were, but actually to give a few sort of comments and then switch primarily to discussion. The reason for that is actually that my main concern with the way that like sort of safety and sort of service are oriented with respect to building stuff, so it tends to get reduced to checklists. Everybody's like, oh, well, so the experts said, like, we do this and that and that and the other thing, and then we're good. And to be totally honest with you, that's not really how it works. Most of the time you're making judgment calls, you have design decisions, you have trade-offs. And the idea of engineering ethics is more, at least for me, one that's based on a set of principles rather than a set of rules. And if you read the article, you'll note that I sort of argued that this is like really old, like older than any particular licensor institution, that we're not doing it because someone said we had to, but rather because we view engineering as something that's done to sort of manage the relationships between humans and technology that we rely upon. And if we believe in a world where these new technologies are actually going to create changes in the way that people, relate with technologies and each other, then we're actually only going to accomplish that by sort of recognizing this maybe more historical relationship between the engineering profession or the engineering sort of social institution and technology. And so the crux of the argument is that look, you should care about how other people are affected by what you build, design, test, how they might be or might not be when there's uncertainty, and exercise the skills that you've developed in order to make sure that you minimize the risk of harm, or sort of generally don't undertake things that are designed essentially with the intent of causing harm, etc. To be honest with you, it's remarkably unspecial, but I think somehow that causes it to lose focus. And so what I wanted to do today was sort of put that provocation out there, and then you can ask me questions, we can have discussion with each other, but the gist of it is sort of how can we use the skills that we're developing? How can we develop new skills that enable us to better serve like sort of the public? And in our case, it's a digital public, and it's not entirely clear always who is the public. And sometimes that's part of what we need to figure out, which stakeholders are affected, not just the ones that maybe we think we're designing for, but the other stakeholders that are affected by our designs. I actually think that's one of the most important aspects as we get into social and economic infrastructure, is that sometimes there are groups of stakeholders that are maybe not totally well represented under our frame of reference, and that expanding our frame of reference and ensuring that we're not externalizing sort of negative elements on parties that are not in our frame of reference can actually go a long way. Okay.
You've walked us already through a lot of the main questions. Maybe let's start at, you mentioned, okay, crypto and engineering ethics feels a little bit, maybe this is not the core concern in crypto, let's say. And but you started this article with going back to the origins of engineering ethics, and maybe you can give us a quick introduction why you started there, and just for those who don't know, that these considerations and discussions on ethics and engineering are actually pretty old. And this is nothing new for us.
Sure. I mean, I think I went back and looked at a couple different citations of sort of descriptions of engineering ethics, with the Cicero's Code being the sort of oldest one that I know of. I don't have it pulled up, so I'm not going to read it off to you. But I mentioned that my own education was very engineering centric, and so this sort of set of ideas was sort of baked into me. I also have family members. My dad, my uncle, my grandfather were all engineers, architects of various sorts, and so the idea that this was a sort of an old tradition was something that was just sort of available to me. And so when it came time to sort of think about it myself, the learnings about the older manifestations were interesting. It sort of gave me a sense of sort of, I don't know, attachment or connectivity through a longer history. But as far as the essay was concerned, I made an effort to go sort of research up some really relevant points, so that it wouldn't just be hearsay or anecdotes. I think we get a lot of Medium articles or like, I had an idea or I feel this way. I tried to make a point to go back and actually flesh out those ideas and substantiate them with actual reference.
And then from there you mentioned a second step, saying, okay, there we could and should establish a new professional engineering value system that applies to token engineering in our case, because you've written this article for TE Commons, Token Engineering Commons. So what was the starting point for
this?
I
actually wrote it even before the TE Commons existed. It was in a Git repo for website copy for I remember the website that you set up, Angela, for token engineering, and it was just kind of like hanging out in a Git repo. And I think it was Griff who like dragged it out and like said, hey, we need to put this on Medium, and did an edit pass or two, and then we put it on the TE Commons Medium, and I think there's a copy of it on Block Science. But I would say probably it's better understood as something that I wrote because there was a coalescing of this idea, token engineering, and I wanted to make sure that token engineering had some aspects of at least what engineering means to me, as well as to give it some differentiation from the, we have what people talking about crypto economics and token economics and tokenomics, and then there's mechanism design, and then there's you name it. Some things like mechanism design have pretty concrete meanings. Like specifically, mechanism design involves designing mechanisms that have certain properties, generally with a game theoretic lens, well, for the most part relatively small scale, like individual mechanisms, not like complex assemblage of mechanisms that interact with each other. To some extent that will fall under market design, but only if you're designing exchange mechanisms specifically. And sort of as you zoom up, you get to these sort of more complex assemblages and the interaction effects between humans and those assemblages. And I generally consider that to be engineering. And for those who don't know, early in this community, Trent and I had some personal debates about whether token engineering or something else, such as economic systems engineering, was a good choice of language. And I argued not for token engineering at the time, and Trent convinced me that it was a good use because of the analogy to electrical engineering, where electrons are sort of that low-level atomic unit of information, like they carry information in circuits. And so tokens being the low-level information carriers, containers that we use to carry information in these social and economic systems. So the crux of the matter was really that there needed to be a difference between what we were hoping to accomplish by practicing engineering methods and sort of bringing in the engineering ethics and distinguishing it just from what kind of stuff you're making, but also like what interests are you serving.
And now one could say, okay, why are engineering ethics particularly relevant in Web3? You touched on it already in the beginning. There are some very particular values that we all share in Web3, and you highlighted them as well, that are privacy, transparency, and agency. And this agency, but also transparency and privacy, puts, I would say, a lot of the responsibility on an individual's behavior, decisions. Now, what's your take on that? Obviously, you still think the engineering ethics are still relevant. Do you see any tension between the Web3 values and engineering ethics?
Yeah, I mean, there are always tensions, but I don't think that they're disjoint in the way that some people sometimes argue that they are. I mean, consider any sort of physical distributed infrastructure. I like using transportation systems as an analogy. I mean, we put a massive amount of onus on, for example, drivers to drive safely, or people to use any sort of public spaces in a way that's not harmful to each other. It's not realistic for us to say that any system that we deploy is going to somehow prevent all possible modes of sort of adverse or harmful behavior. I mean, at that point, you might as well live in a prison. So I don't think it's about making systems where, one is proactively prevented from harming anyone. I'm certainly not a fan of the Minority Report future. But on the other hand, when we do build systems, we affect what the field of action is, like what people can do, what's easy, what's hard. In the practical sense, like agency is about actually making sure that people have meaningful decisions that they can make, and that there's sort of space left, that we're not like hyper constraining things. But that doesn't mean that we're not doing some constraining, and that's part of where the whole engineering ethics stuff comes in. It's that you can recognize the design decisions as ultimately kind of subjective. They're trade-offs. So you have to, the further you push in one direction, maybe the more constraining a system gets, and the further you push in the other, maybe just the more open-ended it gets, to the extent that it's easy or common for people to do things that you might seem as harmful. And the whole point of the engineering ethics argument is not that there's one right answer, but that the reason that you have experts is because part of their job is to actually really understand the trade-offs and make judgment calls with a degree of accountability or willingness to be accountable for the judgment calls that they make. Again, up to a point. Even in the modern system, you can have situations where things go wrong, and the engineers will have like been able to demonstrate the diligence that they put forth, and there won't be a question of sort of fallibility. But on the other hand, if people are cutting corners or there's no clear justification for a decision that ended up being harmful, then generally those are the same people who would bear accountability for it. I know there was quite a hullabaloo with the there's a Boeing airplane a couple years ago that crashed after some sensors were removed, presumably to cut costs, but they were wired into some autopilot systems. And so when one of the sensors was left, but the duplicate sensor that sort of reduced risk by sort of being redundant had been removed. So when the one that they had went haywire, it told the autopilot system the plane was crashing. And so the autopilot system took over and then proceeded to crash the plane because it wasn't actually crashing. So that's a pretty severe decision to remove a sensor because maybe to save costs. At least that's what I had heard. That's the kind of thing where it makes sense to have like a system of accountability in place. I don't think that we run into the same issues with situations where, I mean, if you design a park and there's a, I don't know, someone gets mugged, like you're not responsible for that, right? That's sort of, honestly, it's not so. It feels like the tension sometimes is artificial. Most of the time in practice, like you can tell the difference between things that are like inherent to the thing that you've designed or developed, or the thing is acting as it was intended and it's causing harm, from someone sort of abusing it or misusing it and causing harm. There are certainly cases on the edges that do need to be resolved, but they're special cases, not the general. So it's not so much to take the right decision. I think part of the point is that there isn't the right decision in many cases. As long as there's more than one group of stakeholders, there's almost always more than one group of stakeholders. People can't necessarily like see the whole unless you have some degree of expertise in seeing that whole system. And then those who are responsible for actually serving that whole system need to be able to come up with a sort of sufficiently complete mental map to at least estimate or understand the potential value flows and positive and negative effects on the different stakeholders using that system, and then to make judgment calls about how to manage those trade-offs. And inevitably they're going to be like, someone is not going to be happy. Like, these are inherently sort of political decisions at the end of the day if there are resources being allocated. And in the cases of token engineered systems, there are almost always resources being allocated. Information is being moved, shared, not shared, right? Some of it's private, some of it's public, with that transparency, privacy trade-off. Like even that one, right? You make a judgment call on a particular system about what's the appropriate balance between privacy and transparency, maybe for a particular set of transaction types even. And you will immediately have some people who think more should be private and some who think more should be public. And I'm not saying either of them are wrong. I'm saying that the reason we need to have our own sort of practice, our own discipline, is that somebody needs to start to understand that owning that is actually really important. It's actually more important in some cases than some of the more specific technical expertises. Like, you need the specific technical expertises to practice, but if you're not like willing and able to do that like difficult subjective trade-off bit, then what ends up happening is we only get those decisions from people who are unwilling to acknowledge that there's a subjective trade-off bit. And ultimately that means those subjective trade-off bits are less transparent to the public, when they were made, why they were made, that they're subject to change in the future based on changing circumstances, et cetera, et cetera. So it's that, like, that point of first recognition and surfacing, then making, and just to some extent being willing to be accountable for a subjective trade-off. And also it doesn't mean like you're stuck forever. Part of the reason why we do so much work on governance is that when you surface those things, you also tend to make them a bit more adaptable in the future. You include parameters within your smart contract designs, or you otherwise make it clear that if in the future that trade-off decision is sufficiently out of alignment with what the community wants, or that the stakeholders need, that it is actually subject to change. Not necessarily change easily, because you also don't want to be overly susceptible to capture, but for the most part, it makes sense to have some future capacity to change. And if you're interested in that, I think it's probably on the course agenda, but I wrote a paper on DAOs and cybernetics with Kelsey last year, where we spent most of the time talking about constrained change. Like how does one get a system that's capable of adapting, but not so easily captured?
That's an important point. I think there is no wrong or right. It's about subjective.
It's wrong. Wrong or that when you say there's no wrong or right, you make it sound like everything's equal. I think the way that I envision it is there's a lot of ways to screw it up, but there are only a couple, and but there's more than one way to get it right, and then the choosing between the remaining ways is the subjective choice. I also don't want people to think, oh, it doesn't matter, just pick like whatever, there's no wrong or right. Like that's not the right vibe either. It's like that last mile is the place where the subjectivities come out.
Yeah, thanks for adding that. I just wanted to point out another observation and just to confirm if this would be a fair perspective. It's about trade-offs and it's about adaptive systems. So when we were discussing engineering ethics in our community, it was much about how can I, as a token engineer, take all the burden of the responsibility. I feel that particularly in decentralized systems, we have to be aware that the whole process of developing an ethical system and balancing these trade-offs is also a matter of communication. So would you say it's fair to say, as a token engineer, expect that you have to communicate and that you somehow have to make the subjective decisions baked in algorithms have to be accessible and somehow discussable?
Yeah, actually, so in a traditional engineering regime, you have this idea of public engagement, and public engagement can take many forms. But at least for me, we have the requirements gathering side is an important starting point, which is to say most people don't know or understand exactly what they want in terms of, say, mechanisms or tools. In fact, it's not really fair to expect them to do the level of diligence and learn the number of things required in order to be able to design the system that they would experience for themselves. But it's very reasonable for them to have preference about how the system behaves. And so whenever we think about say token engineered or engineered systems in general, we talk about requirements, and requirements from the end user or end stakeholder perspective need to be articulated in terms of what the end users would hope to experience, whether it's user stories or other requirements. I strongly recommend focusing on what people want to have as the outcome or the experience, rather than on the how it's going to work, because more often than not, the how it's going to work is something that even the engineer shouldn't know yet at the stage of trying to design in the first place. The process of design should flesh that out. So during the but then as you move forward, you also need to start to communicate where the tensions or the trade-offs emerge, because those are exactly the places where people aren't going to get everything that they want. So if you're going through exercises of gathering requirements, of mapping stakeholders, of identifying all of the various functions that a system needs to fulfill in order to be sustainable, then it makes a lot of sense to ensure that those things are surfaced, at least to those who want to engage with them, and to take feedback from those who would be affected during that sort of early set of iterations. For my part, I find that there's a lot of difficulty with serving multiple stakeholder groups. So, even in that phase, people are going to ask for things that are effectively mutually exclusive. And so once you start to surface the points where the constraints bind, or the requirements from different stakeholder groups actually conflict with each other, those are the places that you should bring things forward and sort of make it as early as possible clear as early as possible that some degree of I guess trade-off, or some degree of not getting everything you want all the time is going to be necessary in order to achieve a successful, like, coherent whole system. And then sort of as we move forward, we would look to design things that are, at least to the best of our ability, going to give everyone what they want, but that they don't pretend or try to imagine out of existence the constraints, because in a lot of cases there are fundamentally binding constraints, and dealing with them is going to be much better than trying to pretend they don't exist. And I think we see a lot of systems, particularly in the sort of crypto economics realm, that sort of give too much credence to what people want. And I'll make a specific example of liquidity rewards, sort of liquidity mining programs. It's very, very common for people to vote to put liquidity mining programs into production, and they still nonetheless end up doing often more harm than good, because while they bring capital into those systems and maybe temporarily improve activity measures, they might improve liquidity count, liquidity totals, et cetera, on the whole, they tend to look like they bring a bunch of liquidity in during the program, and that most of that liquidity leaves once the program ends. And so you get a short-term sort of bump, but you get you pay a permanent cost in the sense of monetary base increase. And for the most part, I don't see that as having worked out particularly well. But it's a very common solution, because in the short term, it gives you everything you want, and in the long term, it almost certainly doesn't. So without some, really, I suppose, other retention programs that help keep the people who join those ecosystems during those programs in their communities active in other ways besides just providing capital, it's generally sort of not helpful. And again, I'm using that as an example because it's one where it often seems like a unilaterally good idea. Everyone's like, oh yeah, this is going to be great, and like it's a overwhelmingly passed proposal. And then you get this outcome, and I basically see it as an anti-pattern at this point. So I guess the point here is listening to people is good, very important. Understanding that, like, part of the role of an expert is to actually help people understand what they might not be seeing, and still obviously to serve those people's interest, but serving someone's interest is not always the same as doing exactly what they want. And that's tricky. I mean, it's the reason why the traditional legal system has concepts like fiduciaries, where people are put in a legal obligation to serve the interest of someone other than themselves. But in some cases, they're in that role precisely because the people whose interests are being served may not actually have the specific knowledge required to serve their own interests.
Yeah, you gave a great example with the liquidity provider rewards and then voting and power distribution to get to decisions like that. I wonder if somebody in the audience in the call via the chat or also here at Full Node has some more examples where we just see ethical questions are raised and might be solved in a good way or maybe not sufficient way yet. Just feel free to drop your questions or your examples here, ethical questions that you've experienced. And in addition to that, I just want to mention we have a Slido. I added this link a couple of times to the chat. Let me add it once more, and feel free to drop your questions there, and also to vote on the questions that will help us to surface the most relevant questions for you guys. Now, is there anyone who wants to add another example of an ethical question you've experienced in your time in crypto personally, or observing? Is there anything you'd like to add?
Oh, I'm going to deal with this code is law thing because it's a disaster.
Yeah.
So I had the pleasure of actually asking Lessig about this at DWeb Camp the other week, because obviously I think that the current instantiation of code is law as the crypto community uses it is nonsense. In fact, the question that you just asked, can be code is law or community is law, is a false dichotomy. But basically, the term code is law largely got co-opted to defend the interests of, in the interest of people who wanted to be able to say that code is sort of absolute or like hard, like, you know, something that's immutable and viable. And that isn't even what the term meant when it was coined. So the concepts around code as law is part of a slightly larger conceptual framework that Lessig created, which is humorously called the pathetic dot theory. But it has four sort of modalities for regulating social behavior. One of them is law, one of them is markets, one of them is norms, which is closer to community here, though I hesitate to say it's a perfect bind because I'm assuming you mean voting to change things. And the last one is architecture. So law, norms, markets, and architecture. Architecture being specifically the technical construction of a thing that affects where its frictions are, like what you can do, what you can't do. You know, it's changing the material construction so that things are different. And a lot of the examples in his book, I think, are around cigarettes, where they talk about actually changing the configuration of a cigarette to affect people's experience. But if we take for a moment these four modalities, then I think the code is law idea sort of likens some facets of software architecture to the law regime rather than to the architecture regime, which is generally a bit harder to change. Like, it's a bigger undertaking to modify. And so the code is law sort of, at least for me, actually is better said as algorithms as policy, which is why you see me using that language a lot. It basically says that, you know, writing algorithms is part of governance. It's part of regulating human behavior. You sort of evaluate the possibility space, you make a policy and you implement it. You measure what happens when you implemented it, and then you determine to some extent whether it's fulfilling its intended function. And if you need to, you evaluate it again, and you change policies in order to steer towards your sort of goal, your system's animating purpose. And for me, like, that conceptualization of code as law is fine. That's law in its, like, as it's understood by a lawyer, or at least as one who, you know, I guess in Lessig's case, works on constitutional law. The idea then that code is law is fine as long as you actually sort of take it to its more root meaning, where it's not some absolute immutable thing, and just because the code allow you to do the thing doesn't mean that you should do it or that it should be okay. There's a couple other facets of that, because this comes up a lot, and actually I think it's probably the best center point for this discussion. One of the discussions that I've had around this is that in some ways I guess this might be a silly analogy, but if you've ever played like Dungeons and Dragons, or at least like seen the D&D alignment axis chart, right? You've got good and evil, and you've got lawful and chaotic. And so these two bits, or these two dimensions, sort of highlight the difference between making decisions based on sort of abiding rules, or the stated rules, the rules that sort of make up the substrate of the of the society that you're in, versus doing what you think is like right for others, being selfless versus selfish, and or sort of serving others versus self-serving. So what's interesting is that, and this is a somewhat stylized example, that you could take a topic like MEV and you could start to break it down based on some of these concepts. So if you're gonna sandwich somebody, well, I mean, technically that's legal under the protocol, but it's like very much self-serving, right? You're directly imposing a negative externality on the person who's being sandwiched. So you might argue that that's like a lawful evil activity. You're being maximally self-serving, harming others for your own benefit, but you're actually staying within the rules, and you absolutely are not breaking the rules because it wouldn't work if you broke the rules. So in a system like that, at least at that extreme point where you're sandwiching someone, you're basically behaving on what I would consider the lawful evil portion of the D&D spectrum. But that's not to say that all MEV is actually evil. I think there's quite a lot of neutral and even in some cases arguably good behaviors that go on within the sort of, you know, the mempool and with the transaction modification. Certainly the bots that basically were created to attack the sandwich bots are interesting in so far as they sort of are directly antagonistic with the first group, but there's also plenty of activity that's neutral, bordering on good, in the sense that it just creates market efficiencies. It's, you know, anytime multiple markets get out of alignment with each other, you know, you do need people taking arbitrage, triangle arbitrage, and other transaction sequences that will actually bring the system more into alignment, and not necessarily do so in a way that directly harms people. And I was having some discussions about the, you know, legitimacy of MEV with Primavera de Felipe and some others, and we came up with something really simple as a heuristic, which is called the dick move test, which is basically if you see a MEV after the fact and someone explains it to you, if your response is dick move, then it's probably not like it's illegitimate or exploitive. Whereas if you're anywhere from neutral to like, oh yeah, cool, then it's probably fine. Again, not a particularly hard and fast rule. It's just a way for bringing back this sort of understanding that it's not just about did you follow the rules or not. There is another layer to these systems, and that kind of brings us back to Lessig. And for my part, I think that the normative modality, the norms modality, is something that we really do need to bring into focus and understand that it is part of these systems. And the question of whether community is law, well, I mean, what that means is that if the community is sufficiently in agreement that a particular law needs to be revised, then honestly, even in a traditional system, that tends to happen. So I wouldn't make it too easy. I think that, you know, we need to be careful about capture or knee-jerk reactions. So making it difficult using the architecture modality to reduce the ease of making a critical change can help. But that's where we get back to constitutionality and this idea that, you know, you can change the rules, but if it's going to be a sufficiently big change, maybe it needs to be carefully constrained and or have a high burden to make it happen.
And I think I'd like to take a look at another interpretation of the code is law. So you mentioned one, don't take this simplistic and just because it's code, it might not be ethical. And there's another notion where we see, okay, there's the hope that we can enforce policies and rules through technology in an easier way, even to an extent that some say, oh, with these new systems, we might be able to reduce violence in this world because we don't need violence anymore to enforce rules. Now, this is about governance surface. And I guess in the early days of crypto, there was this hope that we can just reduce the burden of politics, having code that is enforcing our policies, and then ultimately have an easier time for global systems, creating and refining global systems. What's your take on this one, governance surface?
Yeah, so I think the important thing to note is that like reduce is not equal to eliminate. And in most circumstances like that, conflating those two things is causing a lot of issues. So, and if you say, I can eliminate this thing, you are not paying attention to it. You are basically kicked it out of your frame of reference. If you say I can reduce this thing, you're paying really careful attention to it, and you're trying to look at where is it? Where does it come from? How might I reduce it? If I try to reduce it here, does it pop up over there even worse, right? That's what happens when you actually care to reduce something. And I think with crypto in particular, with a lot of these things, we've simply declared that crypto is going to be useful to, potentially eliminate some of these things, and that's not been taken with the diligence required to actually reduce it. And just bearing in mind that, no, I don't think that we can eliminate it. I think eliminating it is actually going to give you something closer to a dystopia than a utopia, because at the end of the day, in order for us to eliminate all sort of politics and governance and reduce everything to rules, like ultimately then you live under those rules and you have no means of adapting them or changing them. You are completely and ultimately constrained by them. That's not a state of empowerment, that's a state of subjugation, which, to be clear, does not mean we want to then have big dumpster fires of bureaucracy. It just means that we need levers. So the idea of a governance surface is the set of mechanisms through which we steer the ship, or change these sort of legal or code systems that that govern us. Yeah, so the idea here, and this relates to this concept of algorithms as policy and governance surfaces, is that you need to have a set of levers that you can use to change the way things work. Those levers don't need to be many necessarily. They don't need to be particularly complex necessarily. But if you try to eliminate them entirely, then you've actually eliminated an important feedback loop between those who are governed and the thing that governs them. Or they basically place us all beneath the API, so to speak, because the algorithm knows best, and we just have to deal with whatever it says. And insofar as we disagree with the way that it's making decisions, we no longer have a mechanism through which to modify the way that it makes decisions. And for me, that is not a world that I want to live in. But I would love to have a world with a whole lot less of this sort of, let's say, lack of transparency in how decisions are made. I mean, I could ramble off for probably an hour about reasons why the status quo is unpleasant from a, sort of governance oversight, sort of the extent to which our voices are actually heard in the way the decisions are made within existing institutions. So I'm 100% on the we can do better with these emerging software-based technologies and democratic processes for inputs into those systems. But yeah, my main take on this is just that if we reduce it too much and we say, oh, well, we're going to eliminate this thing, then we haven't actually done the diligence to try to reduce it effectively. And so basically reducing it means acknowledging it, and acknowledging it includes recognizing that if you press it out of one area, it's very likely to pop up somewhere else. And so when we get back to our discussions of trade-offs, we need to be able to say, hey, we have sort of closed down a particular mechanism over here and reduced the extent to which we can change this. And that means that if people become unhappy with that thing, maybe they're going to move to another thing or do something else. And that's okay. We just, again, we haven't actually eliminated that that governance. We've just shifted its modality.
Okay. I guess we should take a look at the Slido to check out what questions have been added so far, and also what people voted on. I think you can see it.
Yeah.
So here's an overview. The first one on top of the list, how can we implement? Maybe we go across some of these questions for the rest of the time.
Yeah.
Would you like to take
at the top?
one?
Yeah. So how can we? So I'm gonna point out that I don't think you implement accountability. Accountability is a thing that people take. It's not so much something that you can force. So like a DAO is accountable, like insofar as the DAO has an animating purpose that its community owns, and it acts pursuant to that. And I do think this is an important question, is that what I would want to see in DAOs is not an implementation of accountability, but rather sort of a sort of norm of being accountable for the consequences of your collective actions. Not necessarily that a specific person needs to be accountable for the behavior of the DAO, but the DAO's membership body as a whole needs to be aware that their activities as an entity can affect others, possibly others beyond the scope of their membership. And so accountability looks something like recognizing that and maybe taking it into consideration when making decisions. In terms of how this might come to be through technical implementations. When we worked on the DAO Star standard, which makes DAOs more legible. So it says, hey, here's a smart contract with a bunch of URIs, and those URIs give us pointers to membership. They give us pointers to the process through which the DAO makes decisions. It's like a sort of nested, ideally content addressed sequence of pointers that give you information about how DAO make decisions and who's a member of it, et cetera. And like, at least from an implementation standpoint, we would hope that that kind of transparency at the level of the organizational structure might lead to some more accountability. But ultimately, it's not the implementation of accountability that brings accountability. It's sort of the sort of norm, or the cultural norm of actually taking responsibility as a group for the actions that you take as a group.
Okay, should we take another one? And again, you can still vote on the question and add new questions. The second in our row is, what are our current biases towards ethics? How are they different throughout history? Is one better than the other? If so, why? I mean, this also touches nicely on the session earlier today. Local hosts coming from all backgrounds, different cultures. How can we look at ethics throughout history or across the globe? Ethics for Web3 systems.
So our current biases towards ethics are basically, we don't want them to have to exist. I think this is not good. I think that the current state of affairs is, I'm not quite sure how we got to it. It seems like it's rooted in our much broader cultural norms, but we want, or we act as though there is one right answer, and then we sort of push the question of ethics out of the way by searching for the one right answer. We're like, oh, well, if we only found the perfect voting mechanism, or the perfect market mechanism, or the perfect ... you name it, then like it's somehow that perfect thing that we would find would be objectively true and right, and it would do all the work for us, and we wouldn't have to think about any of the sort of messy sort of subjective trade-off details, or have to make calls that would make one person happy and one person unhappy. We'd always just be able to find the right answer. And like, as long as that's our dominant modality, we're never going to develop the muscles to make judgment calls, to deal with trade-offs, to have conversations with each other, to try to surface how to deal with these trade-offs when they're binding, or to sort of acknowledge that something that was the right decision at one point in time may cease to be the right decision in the future. I mean, one of the challenges I have is the sort of constant desire to articulate things as neutral leads to, even if it's good and the right thing that meets everyone's needs today, it entrenches that for the future, because then if some point in the future it needs to be surfaced and reevaluated, then the people who are on the don't change it side have this like extra sort of power to say, oh no, that was neutral, you can't change it. So I'm not saying things can't be designed in a way that meet everybody's needs. I just like really want to get us away from the idea that there's like one unique right answer, and if we just find it and set it in stone, it will work perfectly forever. That's the thing that I think is very modern, and I really don't see it as being I guess the only other place that I sort of imagine that existing was in like a thoroughly like extreme like religious context, where there's just an absolute truth that's inviolable under any circumstances, and yet we use it in a vernacular that's scientific or technical. The truth is that like when the rubber meets the road, that's just not how things work. And so adhering to or appealing to that kind of logic, to me, kind of screws things up. And so we just have to acknowledge that there isn't such a ultimate final perfect solution, and then like work together to find something. And again, this doesn't mean that everything's equal and there's no right or wrong. It just means that the set of acceptable things is probably a set, and that you know, amongst those items, then there's going to be a lot of different reasons for a lot of different design choices, and that the final, like that last mile choice, is going to be something that needs to be treated as a subjective choice.
Great. Chris, I've noticed that you have raised your hands. Give us a moment. Let's go to a third question on the list, and then it's your turn. The third one that I'd like to pick up here is, why should token engineers feel responsible? Since you've wrote this article about engineering ethics in Web3 for token engineers, why should we feel responsible if everybody else doesn't in crypto land?
I mean, my short answer is you don't have to be an engineer. Like, my take on it is that being responsible is part of being an engineer. And again, I'm maybe you could say it's the big E engineer. Plenty of people refer to themselves as engineers who have backgrounds in, say, software engineering. And I'm not trying to diminish that, but like, for me, when I say engineer, I mean that you feel responsible for what you're doing. So, you know, I'm not suggesting that everyone has to be that person, but if we want this space to mature, if we want these systems to be, you know, useful for broader publics and not just useful for, you know, I don't know, like crypto-based, you know, speculative gambling. And to be clear, like, I think there's lots of great things that have and can be done, but that, like, nonetheless, like 99% of what's going on is kind of shenanigans. And you know, I'm hoping to see a maturation of the tech in a way that serves a greater interest than just you know, the sort of what we're seeing today. We don't have a ton of time. I could probably kind of go in and break down the things that I think are really exciting and compelling versus the things that I find a little frustrating and repetitive. But I imagine that you guys can all imagine what those things might be. I think we should save time for the question from Chris.
Right now, final minutes. Chris, switch on your mic. Raise your question.
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me clearly?
We can hear you.
Okay. So I don't know if I fully understand what your commentary on accountability, but from what I got from what you said, I kind of disagreed with you, maybe because of my understanding of the question. So from your comment, what I understand from your comment is you don't see accountability as something that is built into the system, but something that we take as actors in the system. But history has proven otherwise. Like, as in, we are prone to acting for our own self-interest. So if we don't build frameworks that prevent us from doing the things that are detrimental to often the good, the common good for our own self-interest, how do we like enforce people to be good actors? So
that's I understand your criticism is fundamentally Hobbesian. You're just saying, like, all right, humans were, you know, self-interested and we're gonna do harm to others for our own benefit when we get the opportunity. And I think that, at least for me, I don't actually think that that's true. I think it is true to some extent. There will always be some of that. There will be some people who will do things that will harm others for their own benefit. But I would argue that as we group up into, let's say, DAOs, it's actually, at least theoretically, a lot more possible for us to be, you know, mutually accountable to each other and to be capable of, you know, for better or worse, like not exhibiting that pattern of behavior. I'm not arguing that humans don't do things in self-interested ways, but I am arguing that they don't exclusively do things in self-interested ways. And I would recommend doing some various like readings of what I'll call them sort of like alternative I'll call them discourses, whether you read something like Sarah Horowitz on mutualism and talk about how people, even people who strongly disagree with each other, can kind of form up into productive units and collaborate and share. And it's mutualism is sort of a kind of anarchistic tradition, so it's definitely not a like, oh my god, everything's going to be great kind of scenario. It's more of a you know, how people self-organize into sort of cooperative and productive structures. I would also say, if you haven't read it, read The Dawn of Everything by Graeber and Wengrow. They do a pretty good job, and even in the first chapter, sort of disabusing the false dichotomy between Rousseau and Hobbes' take on just people's basic nature. So I get your point. I think that it's just a lot more complex than that, and that the reason we want to experiment with modes of self-organization is maybe to prove that not everybody is always going to act just in their self-interest. And maybe we can use, oh, sorry. I was gonna say, and maybe, you know, some of these structures might help us like reconnect with the circumstances in which we might, you know, use norms, among other things, to I really want to like kind of end on the Lessig stuff with the architecture, the norms, the markets, and the law, because I think that it's the answer to solving the question that Chris is gesturing at, is that we need a different mixture of these materials, and that by evoking the norms part, you know, it might be possible to get a solution that doesn't just look like, well, everyone's bad, so we use the other three to make them be good.
Thanks, Michael Z, for this conversation. I'd like to thank Rohan. You dropped a lot of messages in the chat, and I just wanted to highlight your one of the final ones. In my opinion, poorly designed systems exaggerate selfish behaviors. So we are on top of the hour. Thanks, Z, so much for the conversation. It shouldn't be the last one in our community, I must say. I'd like to highlight module 6. We touched on governance surface and what we can do in governance and to make these systems adaptable as part of the ethical question, adaptable to people's needs, and to integrate many stakeholders' perspectives. Module 5 is about governance, T fundamentals, check it out. And this article and this conversation will be part of module 1 that is available today. Thanks, Z, for joining this conversation. And thanks everyone for taking part with your questions and comments, and see you around at another session in 1 hour or at the T fundamentals and token engineering community Discord.